Have you ever witnessed a moment that completely changed someone's perspective? A seemingly ordinary moment that left behind a lesson lasting a lifetime? The bus came to a stop in the middle of a crowded street. Its doors opening with a familiar screech. Tired passengers stepped in, each carrying their own stories. Among them was an elderly man, his salt and pepper hair bearing the marks of time. He climbed aboard slowly, holding a small bag in one hand and an old wooden cane in the other, its surface polished smooth from years of use. He drew no attention to himself. Nor did he appear remarkable in any way, just a quiet old man searching for a seat by the window. His gaze following the world outside with an unreadable calm. But not everyone respected that peace. At the next stop, a group of young men noisily boarded the bus. They laughed and talked loudly, radiating confidence with a touch of defiance. Almost immediately, they noticed the elderly man sitting quietly in the back. To them, he was an easy target, a weak, defenseless figure who couldn't fight back. And so, the game began. At first, their remarks were nothing more than playful teasing, seemingly harmless. But soon, their words turned crude and provocative. The other passengers glanced over but remained silent. No one wanted to get involved. What they didn't realize was that this man was far from weak. And soon, everything was about to change. The bus doors closed with a soft thud, and the vehicle gave a slight jolt before continuing its journey down the bustling street. Inside, everything remained as usual, some passengers curled up in their coats. Others fixated on their phone screens, each lost in their own world. But that quiet didn't last long. At the next stop, near a high school, a sudden burst of noise disrupted the stillness. A group of 4 teenage boys stormed onto the bus, their voices loud and boisterous as they laughed and shoved each other playfully. They wore their backpacks slung over one shoulder, their jackets unzipped and slightly disheveled, exuding an air of casual defiance. They didn't just take up space with their physical presence, they claimed it with their confidence. Their attitude hinting that this was their world and everyone else was merely an audience to their antics. Within seconds of stepping onto the bus, the tallest of the group, a boy wearing his cap backward, nudged his friend beside him and jerked his chin toward the back of the bus. "Look at that," he muttered, his voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The group's attention immediately shifted to the elderly man sitting quietly. He remained still, hands resting on his wooden cane, gazing out the window as if unaware of their presence. But his silence only intrigued them more. "Hey, old man, you lost or something?" the boy in the cap sneered, amusement lacing his tone. No response. The group erupted into laughter before another boy, smaller but with sharp, mischievous eyes, chimed in. Maybe he's daydreaming about his youth, or counting how many more years till he ends up in a nursing home. Again, silence. The old man didn't move, didn't react, almost as if he hadn't heard them at all. But rather than deterring them, his silence only fueled their amusement. A boy with a buzz cut smirked. "Think he's got some retirement cash in his pocket? Or maybe a bag of cat food?" More laughter followed. Around the bus, a few passengers began shifting uneasily. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse a little tighter, her eyes darting to the side as she kept her head down. A businessman in a suit adjusted his tie, pretending to be busy with his phone, though it was clear he wasn't actually reading anything. The entire bus seemed to be caught between two forces, the boy's growing audacity and the old man's unwavering silence. But what no one realized was that silence did not mean weakness. And in just a few moments, they were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The old man's silence was not what the group of young men had expected. They were used to reactions, anger, fear, or at the very least, a weak response. But here, this old man just sat there, unbothered, his eyes fixed on the world outside, his grip firm on his wooden cane. And that unsettled them. "What's wrong, old man? You deaf?" The boy in the backward cap raised an eyebrow and stepped closer. "Or did you just lose your voice?" The others burst into laughter. Another boy, wearing a gray hoodie, shrugged and added mockingly, "Maybe that cane is the only thing holding him up. Without it, he'd probably break every bone in his body." A few passengers cast uneasy glances their way, but no one spoke up. Everyone knew the unspoken rule: getting involved would only bring trouble. Indifference was always the safest choice. Emboldened by the silence, the group pushed further. The buzz-cut boy, the boldest of the bunch, suddenly leaned down and tapped the tip of the old man's cane with his shoe. "Careful, old man, wouldn't want you dropping this," he said, his voice a mix of teasing and challenge. For the first time, the atmosphere on the bus shifted. The old man moved, just slightly, but it was enough to be noticed. His fingers tightened around the cane's handle. It wasn't an act of defiance or anger, but rather an unconscious reflex, the kind ingrained in someone who had faced situations like this before. Something about the air changed, though it was difficult to explain. One of the boys, the smallest of the group, hesitated and nudged his friend's shoulder. "All right, that's enough. Let's just find a seat." His voice carried a hint of unease. But the boy in the cap wasn't ready to stop. The thrill of being in control was too tempting. "Hey, old man, got any good stories?" he taunted, his grin widening. "Or are you out of things to say? Come on, tell us something. We love war stories." There were chuckles, but not as loud as before. A few passengers were starting to look visibly uncomfortable. An older man sitting nearby sighed but remained silent. And then, for the first time, the old man moved with intention. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his head. No rush, no irritation. His face, lined with age, showed no trace of anger or fear. His deep brown eyes, calm, sharp, and unreadable, finally met those of the boys standing before him. The group fell silent. There was no fury in his gaze, no trembling, no sign of intimidation, just a quiet understanding, one that carried weight. For the first time, their smiles faltered, even if only for a moment. The silence now was no longer passive. It was the stillness before a storm. The bus continued moving, but the air inside felt frozen. The group of young men, who had been so full of laughter and confidence moments ago, now stood still, their eyes locked onto the old man's. They couldn't explain why, but something about his gaze unsettled them. He wasn't angry, wasn't defensive, he simply looked at them. And that look carried a weight, as if he saw right through their bravado, beyond what they were trying to project. For a few seconds, no one said a word. Then, the old man spoke. His voice was low, steady, not loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "This is how you entertain yourselves?" A simple question, yet it hit harder than any accusation. The boys hesitated. None of them had a ready answer. The one in the backward cap, the leader of their little game, tried to regain control. He smirked, shrugging casually. "We're just messing around, old man, no big deal." The old man tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving the boy. "Just messing around?" he repeated, his tone unreadable. "Are you sure about that?" No one was laughing anymore. Another boy, the one in the gray hoodie, shifted uncomfortably. "You're acting like we're some kind of bad guys or something." The old man was silent for a moment. Then, he gave a small nod, as if considering something. "I've met boys like you before," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "In a different place, at a different time." A flicker of curiosity, mixed with unease, passed through the group. "Oh yeah?" The boy in the cap crossed his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. "Where was that?" The old man didn't rush to answer. He slowly lifted his cane, setting it firmly on the floor before speaking. "Vietnam." The word hung in the air, carrying a weight none of them fully understood. A few older passengers glanced at him with quiet recognition, their expressions shifting. A middle-aged woman exhaled softly, as if something had just clicked into place for her. But the young men weren't quite there yet. "Vietnam? Like, the war?" one of them asked. Frowning, the old man nodded. "I enlisted when I was 19. He paused, then added, "Same age as you." The group remained silent. "And back then," he continued, his voice slow and deliberate, "we didn't have time to joke around with strangers. We had to grow up, faster than anyone should." At this point, even the other passengers on the bus were listening. No one was checking their phones or pretending to be absorbed in something else. The young men suddenly felt their throats go dry. The smallest of them glanced at his friends, searching for some kind of reassurance that this situation wasn't as serious as it felt. Then, the old man tightened his grip on his cane. Not as a crutch, not as a threat, just as something to hold onto, as if steadying himself against memories long buried. He looked directly at the boy in the cap, his voice dropping to a deeper, solemn tone. "The men who stood beside me back then, not all of them made it home." The air in the bus thickened. The atmosphere inside the bus had shifted completely. Gone were the laughter, the mocking remarks, the meaningless taunts. The group of young men stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. Stories of war, of those who never made it back. These were not things they had considered when they first stepped onto the bus. Eager to tease an old man, the boy in the backward cap swallowed hard. But he still clung to his composure. So what? He muttered, his voice quieter than before. What does any of that have to do with us? The old man didn't answer right away. He studied the boy carefully. Not with anger, but with a deep, knowing gaze. It has more to do with you than you think, he finally said, his voice steady. Because I've seen boys like you before. Young, confident, thinking they were invincible. Silence. The old man continued, his eyes drifting slightly, as if seeing something far beyond the present moment. They laughed, too. They thought the world belonged to them. But when faced with real fear, with things far worse than they had ever imagined, they stopped laughing. The boy in the gray hoodie swallowed. And, what do you mean by real fear? The old man tilted his head slightly, his expression sharpening. Fear isn't being teased on a bus, he said quietly. It's not insults or judgmental stares. Real fear is hearing footsteps behind you and not knowing if they belong to a friend or an enemy. It's making a split-second decision, pull the trigger, or be shot. A chilling silence settled over the bus. A few older passengers gave small nods, as if they understood all too well what he meant. The old man's fingers tightened slightly around his cane. I lost friends because of bad decisions. I watched boys your age fall because they thought they were stronger than they really were. His gaze locked onto the boy in the cap. Arrogance kills faster than a bullet. The smallest of the group dropped his head, as if those words had struck something deep inside him. The boy in the gray hoodie hesitated before glancing at his friends. Then, in a voice much softer than before, he asked, How many people did you lose? The old man studied him for a long moment before answering. More than I care to remember, he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just a weight, one that pressed down on the entire bus. The group of young men suddenly felt a coldness in their chests, an unease they couldn't shake. The boy in the backward cap finally looked away. For the first time since their encounter began, he had no comeback. None of them did. No one in the group was laughing anymore. The mocking smirks, the dismissive shrugs, they were all gone, replaced by a silence thick with realization. The boy in the backward cap, the one who had led the taunts, now stared down at the bus floor. He had never imagined that a harmless joke could turn into such a heavy lesson. The boy in the gray hoodie exhaled softly, his voice quieter than before. We didn't mean to upset you. The old man gave a slow nod. I know, he said, his voice calm but firm. But the issue isn't whether you meant to or not. It's that you didn't understand what you were doing. Silence. He looked at each of them, his gaze steady yet not unkind. True strength doesn't come from making others feel small so you can feel big. You thought teasing an old man was just harmless fun, but all it really showed was that you don't yet understand what strength means. The words hit hard, but this time, no one argued. The old man continued, his voice steady. Real strength isn't about putting others down. It's knowing when to stand up and when to sit down, when to speak, and when to listen. The smallest of the group swallowed hard. Then, what should we do? A faint smile ghosted across the old man's lips, but his eyes remained serious. Think before you act. Understand that words carry weight, and sometimes they leave wounds deeper than any punch. The young men fell silent. No one had ever spoken to them like this before. The bus slowed as it approached the next stop. None of them said another word. But when the doors opened, they stepped off in quiet contemplation. The arrogance they had carried onto the bus was gone, replaced by something else, something more subdued. The boy in the backward cap hesitated for a moment before stepping out. He glanced back at the old man, meeting his gaze one last time. Then, in a voice lower and more sincere than before, he said, Thanks. The doors shut behind them. The silence inside the bus remained, but it was no longer heavy with tension. It was the kind of stillness that comes with reflection. The other passengers regarded the old man differently now. He was no longer just an elderly figure sitting quietly by the window. He was someone who had seen and endured more than they could ever imagine. A young woman sitting nearby finally broke the silence. her voice filled with quiet respect. "Thank you, for what you did. Both back then and today." The old man nodded, his expression calm yet thoughtful. "I only did what needed to be done," he said. "What matters is whether they learned from it." The bus continued its journey. And somewhere, on that ride, something, or someone, had changed. As the bus continued down the road, the atmosphere had shifted. The passengers were no longer just strangers sharing a ride. They had all witnessed a lesson in respect. In what true strength really meant. The old man remained in his seat, gazing out the window as if nothing had happened. But the words he had spoken, the lesson he had imparted, still echoed in the minds of those who had been there to hear them. A young woman finally broke the silence, her voice soft yet filled with admiration. "Thank you, for everything." The old man simply nodded. There was nothing more to say, he had already said what needed to be said. When the bus reached its final stop, he slowly rose to his feet, leaning lightly on his worn wooden cane. A few passengers instinctively stepped aside, making way for him with quiet respect. Just before stepping off, he turned back, his eyes scanning the faces around him, and left them with one final message. Be kind to one another. You never know what someone else has been through. Then, without another word, he stepped off the bus and disappeared into the bustling streets. The bus rolled forward once more, but no one inside was quite the same. The passengers carried not just the memory of what had transpired, but a lesson that would stay with them, a lesson that strength is not found in insults or intimidation, but in patience, composure, and understanding. And perhaps, somewhere down the road, the group of young men would remember this day. And maybe, just maybe, it would change the way they chose to treat the world.